I'm midway through the massive task of painting all the drawers for this wardrobe build, and I thought I'd share with you today in a quick video how I prepped and painted the exposed MDF edges. And I also wanted to explore whether it matters what type of MDF or paint you use for this. Now, in the past, I've investigated and done videos on numerous ways of tackling those raw MDF edges. The two most effective being using the iron-on paintable edging, or alternatively using wood filler. Great though these methods are, I've got quite a lot of routed edges on my project, rounded edges, and also, given that I've got 12 drawers to do, it's hard enough painting all these drawers without having to fill every single edge. And quite frankly, I don't think it's necessary, as I'll be showing you today. However, if you are sold on the filler approach, stay tuned to the end, where I'll be having a quick look at this Samet Filler that a cabinet maker recommended I buy earlier on this week. But there have been three significant differences on this job to how I'd normally prepare my MDF edges. Firstly, I've used moisture resistant MDF. Secondly, I've used a much more efficient sander than I've used before. And finally, I've gone back to my preferred primer, Zinsser BIN. And in today's video, I'll be assessing how important these factors have been, if at all, in the process. So why don't I think paintable edges or filler is necessary? Well, bottom line, I think we get far too hung up on how to paint MDF edges. Quite simply, it's a myth that those raw edges are not properly paintable. And the only reason we all tend to make a meal of this job is that we're not properly preparing those edges prior to painting. In short, where we all go wrong is thinking that that cut edge we get from our circular saw or plunge saw, or even from a builder's merchant's or DIY store if they cut it for you, is ready for painting, because it's not. You have to sand down that raw edge prior to priming, and just look at the difference between an edge that hasn't been sanded and an edge that has. Now, I've sort of known this in the past, and I've done a bit of sanding with my old Bosch vibrating sander, or perhaps a block of wood or a sanding block like this. I wouldn't use my belt sander because it's too powerful and it would take dents out of the surface. But I never really realised how effective it could be when paired with a decent sander. And on this job, I started to finish all the edges with my Ryobi random orbit sander that I was gifted by Ryobi about a year ago. And this was a light bulb moment which made me think, I've got to do a video on this. The fact that it's a Ryobi is just because I have a lot of Ryobi batteries. But there are a lot of options available out there. The most reasonably priced being the mains powered versions, but there are also some reasonably priced 18 volt bare options, which would make this very affordable if you already have a load of batteries lying around for your drills or drill drivers. And I massively advise you to get one because I've never used one until recently, and I've been blown away by the results on this project, both in terms of the power of the sander, but also its dust extraction efficiency when teamed up with a vacuum. I bought 100 sander discs from Amazon for just over £10, but to sand the edges I've mostly used either these 120 grit mesh discs or 240 grit aluminium oxide discs that Trend recently sent me to try out. A quick run down the edge swiftly took away the slightly rough surface left by my plunge saw and produced a near glassy finish. Contrast that with the finish on things like this drawer divider, which I didn't sand before priming, and you see why this is so important. Because when you prime the sanded surface, minimal end grain raises up after that initial prime, leaving you very little sanding to do, literally a few seconds, with some 180 or 240 grit sandpaper between coats. And whilst I only put one coat of primer on the drawers themselves, I did put 2 coats of primer on those end grains with that small bit of sanding in between each coat. Let's have a quick chat about the importance or otherwise of using the right primer. I've used loads of primers over the years, from standard wood primers to more bespoke MDF versions. And in my last video on this wardrobe build, you saw me experimenting with Zinsser Bullseye 123. But to paint these drawers, I thought I'd go back to my favourite primer, Zinsser BIN, using these 100% wool mini roller sleeves and a paintbrush for cutting into the corners. And I think someone going by the name of blah 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 put it wonderfully in his comment just on Thursday this week when he said that water-based paints tend to gum up the sandpaper when compared to shellac, which sounds more like a drywall compound, as you see here. And with the primer going on as thin as it does, you can immediately spot and sort out any imperfections on the surface. And then you've got the 45-minute repaint time, which turbocharges your productivity when you've got as many drawers to paint as I have. And the finish is, I think, pretty good. So for the base of the drawers, which are screwed to the bottom for that extra strength and simplicity of build, I was worried the end grain might be quite obvious on the side, but with this sanding technique, the end grain has pretty much merged seamlessly into the sides. So that's all well and good, but it still leaves you wondering how important it is to use the right paint and whether or not it was significant that I was using moisture resistant MDF for these drawers. Well, I thought I'd found out the answer to this once and for all by getting an old piece of standard MDF, pretty low quality, not Medite or anything like that, and see if I could get the same results. I took the fluffiest edge I could find on the piece and made 2 sections so I could see if there was any difference using the shellac-based Zinsser bin as opposed to the water-based 123. Given the depth of the fluffy end grain, the 120 grit mesh wasn't abrasive enough, and so I traded up to 40 grit disc, which quickly removed all the rough end grain, leaving me to finish off with a 240 grit trimmed disc. And then it was on to the priming, first with the Zinsser bin and then on the right hand piece the Bullseye 123. A bit of light hand sanding with some 240 grit sandpaper, and both are looking pretty smooth, perhaps with the end grain being a bit more apparent on the 123 piece than on the bin, and being a little less smooth to the touch. Another quick coat of primer, and then it was on with 2 coats of the acrylic eggshell top coat, again applied with a wool mini roller sleeve with a cursory sand between coats. And the end result, they're both almost indistinguishable with a slightly mottled finish, more down to the nature of the roller sleeve than any residual end grain. If I'm honest, the side painted with the Bullseye 123 was slightly more porous than the shellac-based bin because you can see a slight band down the middle. But this is something and nothing, and I think the conclusion you can draw from this is that the moisture-resistant MDF didn't make any difference to the overall finish than if I'd used a standard MDF. And whilst the shellac primer leaves you a slightly superior finish, it's not enough to warrant going for this primer if you much prefer washing your paintbrushes and rollers in water. But after all that, if you're still keen to go down the filler route, you might take a look at this Samet Filler, which was recommended to me last week by a cabinet maker. I'm sorry I didn't write your name down, but the point about this is that, in his words, it applies like an icing sugar paste, typically used for filling veneers, and in fact I bought it really to repair the gilding on this mirror. Apparently it's also great for edge grain on MDF and screw and nail holes. I've got to say, it goes on beautifully, and you don't have the worry you have with the 2-part wood filler I'd usually use of it setting in 5 minutes flat. That's all I know about it, so if you've got any experiences using it, please let us know in the comment section below, and thanks again to the professional cabinet maker out there for giving me the recommendation. Please keep these recommendations coming, I write them all down. So that's it for today. I'll be back shortly with the next wardrobe build update, and I've got some quite interesting other stuff in the pipeline. It'd be great if you could give this video the thumbs up below if you've enjoyed it. And don't forget, details of all today's tools will be in the description below the video, which of course you can access on your smartphone by clicking on the little arrow and your PC by clicking on the Show More button. And finally, if you're new to my channel, I'd love to have you subscribe. It would mean so much to me, and you can do that by clicking on the link here. And don't forget to click on the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. See you soon.